I'm Doug Cuny and this is my kitchen. Welcome back to part 2 of making fresh rye bread. Now at this point, we've taken our starter, we've made our leaven is ready to use, and we're going to mix it with our dry ingredients and make our dough and proceed with the fermentation process. Now I'm sure that the first question that most of you are going to ask is, how long do you let your leaven ferment? And I'm not going to give you an answer to that. And the reason is that it can vary wildly depending upon the temperature of your house. Right now where I'm at, it's about 10 degrees outside and it's about 65 degrees in the house. Now if you happen to be living, let's say in Arizona somewhere, and you've got a 80-82 degree day and it's dry and comfortable, and you open up the windows and you're making bread, your dough is going to ferment at a lot different rate than it is here in my cool house. I know people like to follow instructions, but if I give you time to go by, then chances are you're just going to fall back on that time and not have the kind of results that you would if you actually determined by the condition of your dough when it was ready. Now a few years back, Chad Robertson wrote a book called Tartine Bread, and if you're interested in making really good hearth style bread at home, you ought to pick the book up and read it. I highly recommend it. He had a technique in there that I had never heard of before, and I've used it ever since. And he actually tests his leaven to see if it's ready to use. And this is great because instead of saying, well, let's see, I need to let this rise for so many hours, he tests it from time to time and then knows when it's actually ready instead of going by some rote rule. Now the advantage to doing this is that you actually get optimum results from your bread making techniques because you actually know where you are in the process. In other words, when your leaven passes this test, you know it's ready, not only that it's ready to go, but it's still at its fresh stage. Now if you want to make a sourdough leaven or sourdough bread, you can let it ferment longer if you want, but for what we're doing here, we want a fresh loaf, so we're going to incorporate the leaven while it's still fresh. Another great thing about testing your leaven instead of going by a timetable is that by testing your leaven and knowing that it's at the point where it can be used, or its fresh stage, you also know how long it's going to be before your bread is at its fresh stage. Because unless you go from baking bread in a 65 degree house to baking the same bread in an 80 degree house, your environment's going to be the same. So you can actually set up your time schedule to suit the kind of bread you want. If you want a sourdough loaf, you can test it, you know when it's at its fresh stage, and then let it ferment longer. But we're going to make a fresh loaf. So what I'm going to do now is show you the leaven, and we'll assemble the ingredients for the bread. All right, so we've got our leaven ready to go. And I don't know if you can see it or not, but there is a lot of bubbles formed, and they're beginning to break the surface. And this means that you're real close to where you want to be. Now, in order to test it, this is a great test. You're going to take yourself a little spoon of this, and now the part that I actually mashed down is kind of going to the bottom. But the rest of it is floating here because of the gas content. And that tells you that it is indeed ready to be used. And if it doesn't float, then take that, drain a little water off, put it back into your leaven and either put it in a warmer place, let it set for a while, or just let it set until it gets to this stage. Now I've got the water here, and we're going to use for our 1,000 grams of flour, we're going to use 800 grams of water. So that's 80% hydration. I'm going to set back 50 grams of the water for use in a little bit. So here I have basically the water that we're going to use for the mixture, and it's 750 grams of filtered water. So just like I did when I put the starter in here, I'm going to take this leaven and dissolve it in the water so that it's easier to mix into our dry ingredients. There. So now I'll just break that up. Actually, I think the best thing we can do in this case is just get in there with your hands. Just squish it on through your fingers. That breaks it up a lot faster. And that pretty much did the ticket right there. We've got our leaven dissolved into our 750 grams of water. So in addition to that, I'll set that to one side. I have 830 grams of bread flour and 170 grams of rye flour. So I'm going to mix those two together. Those will do our dry ingredients, almost. Now, I also have 2 tablespoons of cocoa powder. And if you were, let's say, making whole wheat instead of rye, you'd leave this out. Or you could leave it out of this recipe. The reason I add the cocoa powder is that it actually gives the rye bread a darker color, but there's also a slight chocolate hint that goes into the bread, obviously, but it's not so much that's going to make the bread taste like chocolate. It just gives it another dimension. So I'll put that in with the dry ingredients, and then I will stir this up. All right, now we've got the dry ingredients, the rye, the bread flour, and the cocoa. The salt isn't going to go in yet, or the remaining 50 grams of water. Here I have the remaining 50 grams of water and 20 grams of salt. And what I'm going to do is add the salt to the water. I'm going to let that dissolve and set that to one side. And then once I mix this up, the bread up, I will take the water and salt mixture and knead that in. I'm going to give, in this case, probably about an hour head start and let the fermentation process begin before I actually start the before I actually add the salt water to it. The salt tends to inhibit the fermentation until it really gets established, so I'll just put that off for a little bit. So I think what I'm going to do is get a spatula instead of a wooden spoon, and I'm going to add my water and leaven mixture. There we go. So, I'm going to start mixing these two together, get our dough going. Now, because we still have, well, dough is usually stiff when it's fresh. Before it really starts to ferment, it relaxes a little bit. It's going to be very tight. But we still have another 50 grams of water to go into this, so it is going to be kind of stiff. 50 grams isn't a lot of water, but the overall texture of the dough is going to change considerably when we add that little bit of extra water and the salt. So I think at this point, now that we've got a substantial dough here, I'm going to clean this off. And I'm going to mix the rest of this with my hand. Just makes it a little bit more efficient, and there's always just a little bit left at the bottom that you need to kind of turn it over and get that up. All right, as soon as you don't have any dry flour left, I think you pretty well got it. So we've got our dough mixed, and we're going to let that rest for about an hour. And I think what I'm going to do now is just cover that with a piece of cloth, and we'll be back in an hour. Now the dough is set for an hour and it's relaxed. We're going to take our salt and water mixture, stir that up, and just add that right on top of it. Now I'm just going to get in there and work that water right into the dough. Now when you first start working the dough, you don't think that it's going to take that water up, but if you actually squeeze the dough through your fingers, break it up, all of a sudden you realize that it's absorbed all the water. Now I put this in this clear container so that you can actually could see it being done. I'm going to transfer it back into a larger bowl, and then I'm going to cover it up because it's going to start rising at this point, and I'm going to let it sit for another hour. And then from here we'll continue with part 3.